bags, she hastened after with her own suitcase. The rest was like some nightmare show in which a wild girl in the audience breaks onto the stage to take upon herself an unplanned part that was never written or meant to be. "You are the we of me," her heart was saying, but she could only say aloud, "Take me." And they pleaded and begged with her, but she was already in the car. And at the last, she clung to the steering wheel until her father and somebody else had hauled and dragged her from the car. And even then, she could only cry in the dust of the empty road, "Take me, take me." But there was only the wedding company to hear, for the bride and her brother had driven away. Bernice said, "School will begin now in only 3 more weeks, and you'll go into the A section of the 7th grade and meet a lot of nice new children and make another bosom friend like that Evelyn Owen you were so wild about." The kind tone Frances could not stand. "I never meant to go with them," she said. "It was all just a joke. They said they were going to invite me to a visit when they got settled, but I wouldn't go, not for $1,000,000. "We know all about that," said Bernice. "Now, listen to my surprise I've planned. Soon as you get settled in school and have a chance to make these friends, I think it would be a good idea to have a party. A lovely bridge party in the living room with potato salad and those little olive sandwiches your Aunt Pet had for a club meeting you were so carried away about. The round-shaped kind with the tiny round hole in the middle and the olive showing. A lovely bridge party with delicious refreshments. How would you like that?" The baby promises rasped her nerves. Her cheap heart hurt, and she pressed her crossed arms over it and rocked a little. It was a framed game. The cards were stacked. It was a frame-up all around. "We can have that bridge party going on in the living room, and out in the backyard we can have another party at the same time, a costume party with hot dogs. One party dainty and the other one rough, with prizes for the highest bridge score and the funniest costumes. How does that strike you?" Frances refused to look at Bernice or answer. "You could call up the society editor of the Evening Journal and have the party written up in the paper, and that would make the 4th time your name has been published in the paper." It would, but a thing like that no longer mattered to her. Once, when her bike ran into an automobile, the paper had called her Fanky Adams. Fanky! But now she did not care. "Don't be so blue," said Bernice. "This is not doomsday." "Frankie, don't cry," John Henry said. "We will go home and put up the teepee and have a good time." She could not stop crying, and the sobbing had a strangled sound. "Oh, hush up your mouth. Listen to me. Tell me what you would like, and I'll try to do it if it's in my power." "All I would like," said Frances after a minute, "all I wish in the world is for no human being ever to speak to me so long as I live." And Bernice said finally, "Well, then, bawl then, misery." They did not talk the rest of the way back to the town. Her father slept with a handkerchief over his nose and eyes, snoring a little. John Henry West lay in her father's lap and slept also. The other passengers were drowsy quiet, and the bus rocked like a cradle and made a softly roaring sound. Outside, the afternoon shimmered, and now and then there was a buzzard lazily balanced against the blazing pale sky. They passed red, empty crossroads with deep red gulches on either side, and rotten gray shacks set in the lonesome cotton fields. Only the dark pine trees looked cool, and the low blue hills when seen from miles away. Frances watched from the window with a stiff, sick face, and for 4 hours did not say a word. They were entering the town, and a change came. The sky lowered, and turned a purple-gray against which the trees were a poison green. There was a jellied stillness in the air, and then the mutter of the first thunder. A wind came through the treetops with a sound like rushing water, forewarning storm. "I told you so," said Bernice, and she was not speaking of the wedding. "I could feel the misery in these joints. After a good storm, we'll all feel much better." The rain did not come, and there was only a feeling of expectation in the air. The wind was hot. Frances smiled a little at Bernice's words, but it was a scorning smile that hurt. "You think it's all over," she said, "but that only shows how little you know." They thought it was finished, but she would show them. The wedding had not included her, but she would still go into the world. Where she was going she did not know. However, she was leaving town that night. If she could not go in the way she had planned, safe with her brother and the bride, she would go anyway, even if she had to commit every crime. For the first time since the night before she thought about the soldier, but only in a glancing way, for her mind was busy with hasty plans. There was a train that passed through the town at 2 o'clock, and she would take it. The train went north in a general way, probably to Chicago or New York. If the train went to Chicago, she would go on to Hollywood and write shows or get a job as a movie starlet. Or, if worse came to worse, even act in comedies. If the train went to New York, she would dress like a boy and give a false name and a false age and join the Marines. Meanwhile, she had to wait until her father was asleep and she could hear him moving in the kitchen. She sat at the typewriter and wrote a letter. "Dear Father, this is a farewell letter until I write you from a different place. I told you I was going to leave town because it is inevitable. I cannot stand this existence any longer because my life has become a burden. I am taking the pistol because who can tell when it might come in handy, and I will send back the money to you at the very first opportunity. Tell Bernice not to worry. The whole thing is an irony of fate, and it is inevitable. Later, I will write. Please, Papa, do not try to capture me. Sincerely yours, Frances Adams." The green and white moths were nervous at the window screen, and the night outside was queer. The hot wind had stopped, and the air was so still that it seemed solid, and there was a weight against you when you moved. The thunder grumbled low occasionally. Frances sat motionless before the typewriter, wearing the dotted Swiss dress, and the strapped suitcase was beside the door. After a while, the light in the kitchen was turned off, and her father called from the foot of the stairs. "Good night, Pickle Priss. Good night, John Henry." Frances waited a long time. John Henry was sleeping across the foot of the bed, still dressed with his shoes on, and his mouth was open, and one ear of his glasses frame had come loose. After waiting as long as she could stand it, she took the suitcase and tiptoed very quietly down the stairs. It was dark down there, dark in her father's room, dark through the house. She stood on the threshold of her father's room, and he was snoring softly. The hardest time was the few minutes she stood there, listening. The rest was easy. Her father was a widow man, set in his ways, and at night he folded his pants over a straight chair and left his wallet, watch, and glasses on the right-hand side of the bureau. She moved very quietly in the darkness and laid hand on the wallet almost immediately. She was careful opening the bureau drawer, stopping to listen each time there was a scraping sound. The pistol felt heavy and cool in her hot hand. It was easy except for the loudness of beating heart and for an accident that happened just as she crept from the room. She stumbled over a wastepaper basket and the snoring stopped. Her father stirred, muttered. She held her breath. Then finally, after a minute, The snoring went on again. She put the letter on the table and tiptoed to the back porch. But there was one thing she had not counted on. John Henry began to call. "Frankie!" The high child voice seemed to carry through all the rooms of the night house. "Where are you?" "Hush," she whispered. "Go back to sleep." She had left the light on in her room, and he stood in the stairway door and looked down into the dark kitchen. "What are you doing down there in the dark?" "Hush," she said again in a loud whisper. "I'll be there by the time you get to sleep." She waited a few minutes after John Henry had gone, then groped to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. But though she was very quiet, he must have heard her. "Wait, Frankie!" he wailed. "I'm coming!" The child wailing had waked her father, and she knew it before she reached the corner of the house. The night was dark and heavy, and as she ran, she heard her father calling her. Behind the corner of the house, she looked and saw the kitchen light go on. The bulbs swing back and forth, making a swinging gold reflection on the arbor and the dark yard. He will read the letter now, she thought, and chase and try to capture me. But after she had run a few blocks, the suitcase bumping against her legs and sometimes nearly tripping her, she remembered that her father would have to put on pants and a shirt, for he would not chase her through the streets dressed only in pajama bottoms. She stopped for a second to look behind. No one was there. At the first street light, she put down the suitcase and, taking the wallet from the front pocket of her dress, opened it with shaking hands. Inside, there was $3.15. She would have to hop a boxcar or something. All at once, alone there in the night-empty street, she realized she did not know how. It is easy to talk about hopping a freight train, but how did bums and people really do it? She was 3 blocks from the station, and she walked toward it slowly. The station was closed, and she went round it and stared at the platform, long and empty under the pale lights, with the chiclet machines against the station wall and scraps of chewing gum paper and candy wrappings on the platform. The train tracks gleamed silver and exact, and some freight cars were off on a siding in the distance, but they were not hooked to any engine. The train would not come until 2 o'clock, and would she be able to hop a car, as she had read about, and get away? There was a red lantern a little way down the tracks, and against this colored light she saw a railroad man come walking slowly. She could not hang around like that until 2 o'clock. But as she left the station, one shoulder dragged down by the weight of the bag, she did not know where she should go. The streets were lonesome and idle with Sunday night. The red and green neon lights in the signboards mixed with the street lights to make a pale hot haze above the town, but the sky was starless, black. A man in a tilted hat took out a cigarette and turned to stare at her as she passed by. She could not wander around the town like this, for by this time her father would be chasing her. In the alley behind Finney's place, she sat down on the suitcase, and only then she realized that the pistol was still in her left hand. She had been going around with the pistol held right in her hand, and she felt that she had lost her mind. She had said that she would shoot herself if the bride and her brother would not take her. She pointed the pistol at the side of her head and held it there a minute or two. If she squeezed down on the trigger, she would be dead, and deadness was blackness. Nothing but pure, terrible blackness that went on and never ended until the end of all the world. When she lowered the pistol, she told herself that at the last minute she had changed her mind. The pistol she put in her suitcase. The alley was black and smelled of garbage cans, and it was in this alley where Lon Baker had his throat slashed that spring afternoon, so that his neck was like a bloody mouth that gibbered in the sun. It was here Lon Baker had been killed. And had she killed the soldier when she brained his head with the water pitcher? She was scared in the dark alley, and her mind felt splintered. If only there was someone with her. If only she could hunt down Honey Brown and they could go away together. But Honey had gone to Forks Falls and would not be back until tomorrow. Or if she could find the monkey and the monkey man and join with them to run away. There was a scuttling noise, and she jerked with terror. A cat had leaped up on a garbage can, and in the darkness she could see its outline against the light at the end of the alley. She whispered, "Charles?" and then, "Charlena?" But it was not her Persian cat. And when she stumbled toward the can, it sprang away. She could stand the black, sour alley no longer, and, carrying the suitcase toward the light at the end, she stood close to the sidewalk, but still inside the shadow of a wall. If there was only somebody to tell her what to do and where to go and how to get there. The fortune of Big Mama had turned out true about the sort of trip and a departure and a return, and even the cotton bales, for the bus had passed a truck of them on the way back from Winter Hill. And there was the sum of money in her father's wallet, so that already she had lived up all the fortune Big Mama had foreseen. Should she go down to the house in Sugarville and say that she had used up the whole future? And what was she now to do? Beyond the shadow of the alley, the gloomy street was like a street that waited, with the winking neon Coca-Cola sign on the next corner, and a lady walking back and forth beneath the streetlight, as though expecting someone. A car, a long closed car that maybe was a Packard, came slowly down the street, and the way it cruised close to the curb reminded her of a gangster's car, so that she shrank back closer to the wall. Then, on the opposite sidewalk, two people passed, and a feeling like a sudden flame sprang up inside her. And for less than a second, it seemed that her brother and the bride had come for her and were now there. But the feeling blew out instantly, and she was just watching a stranger couple passing down the street. There was a hollow in her chest, but at the bottom of this emptiness, a heavy weight pressed down and bruised her stomach so that she felt sick. She told herself she ought to get busy and pick up her feet and go away, but she still stood there, her eyes closed and her head against the worn brick wall. When she left the alley, it was a long time after midnight. She had reached the point where any sudden idea seemed a good idea. She had seized on first one notion and then another. To hitchhike to Forks Falls and track down Honey, or to wire Evelyn Owen to meet her in Atlanta, or even to go back to the house and get John Henry so that at least there would be somebody with her and she would not have to go into the world alone. But there was some objection to each of these ideas. Then, all at once, from the tangle of turning impossibilities, she thought of the soldier. And this time, the thought was not a glancing one. It lingered, stuck, and did not go away. She wondered if she ought to go to the Blue Moon and find out if she had killed the soldier before she left the town forever. The idea once seized on seemed to her good, and she started for Front Avenue. If she had not killed the soldier, then when she found him, what could she say? How the next thought occurred to her she did not know, but suddenly it seemed she might as well ask the soldier to marry with her, and then the two of them could go away. Before he had gone crazy, he'd been a little nice, and because it was a new and sudden idea, it also seemed reasonable. She remembered a part of the fortune she had forgotten, that she would marry a light-haired person with blue eyes, and the fact that the soldier had light red hair and blue eyes was like a proof that this was the right thing to do. She hurried faster. The night before was like a time that had happened so long ago that the soldier was unraveled in her memory. But she recalled the silence in the hotel room, and all at once a fit in a front room, the silence, the nasty talk behind the garage. These separate recollections fell together in the darkness of her mind, as shafting searchlights meet in the night sky upon an aeroplane, so that in a flash there came in her an understanding. There was a feeling of cold surprise. She stopped a minute, then went on toward the blue moon. The stores were dark and closed, the pawn shop window locked with crisscross steel against night robbers, and the only lights were those from the open wooden stairs of the buildings and the greenish splash of brightness from the blue moon. There was a sound of quarreling voices from an upper story, and the footsteps of two men far down the street walking away. She was no longer thinking of the soldier. The discovery of the moment before had scattered him from her mind. There was only knowing that she must find somebody, anybody, that she could join with to go away. For now, she admitted she was too scared to go into the world alone. She did not leave the town that night, for the law caught her in the blue moon. Officer Wiley was there when she walked in, although she did not see him until she was settled at the window table with the suitcase on the floor beside her. The jukebox sounded a sleazy blues, and the Portuguese owner stood with his eyes closed, playing up and down the wooden counter in time to the sad juke tune. There were only a few people in a corner booth, and the blue light gave the place a look of being under seas. She did not see the law until he was standing beside the table, and when she looked up at him, her startled heart quivered a little and then stopped still. "You're Royal Adam's daughter," the law said, and her head admitted with a nod. "I'll phone into headquarters to say you're found. Just stay right here." The law went back to the telephone booth. He was calling the Black Maria to haul her off down to the jail, but she did not care. Very likely she had killed that soldier, and they had been following clues and hunting her all over town. Or the law maybe had found out about the three-way knife she had stolen from the Sears and Roebuck store. It was not plain just what she was captured for, and the crimes of the long spring and summer merged together as one guilt, which she had lost the power to understand. It was as though the things that she had done, the sins committed, had all been done by someone else, a stranger a long time ago. She sat very still, her legs wrapped tight around each other, and her hands clasped in her lap. The law was a long time at the telephone, and, staring straight ahead of her, she watched two people leave a booth and, leaning close against each other, start to dance. The soldier banged the screen door and walked through the cafe, and only the distant stranger in her recognized him. When he had climbed up the stairs, she only thought slowly and with no feeling that a curly red head such as that one was like cement. Then her mind went back to thoughts of jail, and cold peas, and cold cornbread, and iron-barred cells. The law came back from the telephone and sat down across from her and said, "How did you happen to come in here?" The law was big in his blue policeman's suit, and, once arrested, it was a bad policy to lie or trifle. He had a heavy face with a squatty forehead and unmatched ears. One ear was larger than the other and had a torn look. When he questioned her, he did not look into her face, but at some point just above her head. "What am I doing in here?" she repeated, for all at once she had forgotten, and she told the truth when she said finally, "I don't know." The voice of the law seemed to come from a distance, like a question asked through a long corridor. "Where were you headed for?" The world was now so far away that Frances could no longer think of it. She did not see the earth as in the old days, cracked and loose and turning 1,000 miles an hour. The earth was enormous and still and flat. Between herself and all the places, there was a space like an enormous canyon she could not hope to bridge or cross. The plans for the movies or the Marines were only child plans that would never work, and she was careful when she answered. She named the littlest, ugliest place she knew, for to run away there could not be considered so very wrong. Flowering Branch. Your father phoned headquarters. You had left a letter that you were running away. We located him at the bus station, and he'll be here in a minute to take you home. It was her father who had sicked the law on her, and she would not be carried to the jail. In a way, she was sorry. It was better to be in jail where you could bang the walls than in jail where you could not see. The world was too far away, and there was no way any more that she could be included. She was back to the fear of the summertime, the old feelings that the world was separate from herself, and the failed wedding had quickened the fear to terror. There had been a time only yesterday when she felt that every person that she saw was somehow connected with herself, and there was between the two of them an instant recognition. Frances watched the Portuguese who still played a mock piano on the counter to the jukebox tune. He swayed as he played, and his fingers skittered up and down the counter, so that a man at the far end protected his glass with his hand. When the tune was over, the Portuguese folded his arms upon his chest. Frances narrowed and tensed her eyes to will him to look at her. He had been the first person she had told the day before about the wedding, but as he gave an owner's look around the place, his glance passed by her in a casual way, and there was in those eyes no feeling of connection. She turned to the others in the room, and it was the same with all of them, and they were strangers. In the blue light, she felt queer as a person drowning. At last, she was staring at the law, and finally, he looked into her eyes. He looked at her with eyes as china as a doll's, and in them there was only the reflection of her own lost face. The screen door slammed, and the law said, "Here's your daddy, come to take you home." Frances was never once to speak about the wedding. Weathers had turned, and it was in another season. There were the changes, and Frances was now 13. She was in the kitchen with Bernice on the day before they moved, the last afternoon that Bernice would be with them. For when it had been decided that she and her father would share with Aunt Pet and Uncle Eustace a house out in the new suburb of town, Bernice had given quit notice and said that she might as well marry Titi. It was the end of an afternoon in late November, and in the east the sky was the color of a winter geranium. Frances had come back into the kitchen, for the other rooms were hollow since the van had taken the furniture away. There were only the two beds in the downstairs bedrooms and the kitchen furniture, and they were to be moved tomorrow. It was the first time in a long while that Frances had spent an afternoon back in the kitchen, alone with Bernice. It was not the same kitchen of the summer that now seemed so long ago. The pencil pictures had disappeared beneath a coat of calcimine, and new linoleum covered the splintery floor. Even the table had been moved, pushed back against the wall, since now there was nobody to take meals with Bernice. The kitchen, done over and almost modern, had nothing that would bring to mind John Henry West, but nevertheless there were times when Frances felt his presence there, solemn and hovering and ghost gray. And at those times there would come a hush quivered by voiceless words. A similar hush would come also when Honey was mentioned or brought to mind, for Honey was out on the road now with a sentence of 8 years. Now the hush came that late November afternoon as Frances was making the sandwiches, cutting them into fancy shapes and taking great pains, for Mary Littlejohn was coming at 5 o'clock. Frances glanced at Bernice, who was sitting idle in a chair, wearing an old raveled sweater, her limp arms hanging at her sides. In her lap there was the thin little pinched fox fur that Ludi had given her many years ago. The fur was sticky, and the sharp little face fox-wise and sad. The fire from the red stove brushed the room with flickers of light and changing shadows. "I'm just mad about Michelangelo," she said. Mary was coming at 5 o'clock to take dinner, spend the night, and ride in the van to the new house tomorrow. Mary collected pictures of great masters and pasted them in an art book. They read poets like Tennyson together, and Mary was going to be a great painter and Frances a great poet, or else the foremost authority on radar. Mr. Littlejohn had been connected with a tractor company, and before the war the Littlejohns had lived abroad. When Frances was 16 and Mary 18, they were going around the world together. Frances placed the sandwiches on a plate, along with 8 chocolates and some salted nuts. This was to be a midnight feast, to be eaten in the bed at 12 o'clock. "I told you we're going to travel around the world together." "Mary Littlejohn," said Bernice in a tinged voice. "Mary Littlejohn." Bernice could not appreciate Michelangelo or poetry, let alone Mary Littlejohn. There had at first been words between them on the subject. Bernice had spoken of Mary as being lumpy and marshmallow white, and Frances had defended fiercely. Mary had long braids that she could very nearly sit on, braids of a woven mixture of corn yellow and brown, fastened at the ends with rubber bands and, on occasions, ribbons. She had brown eyes with yellow eyelashes, and her dimpled hands tapered at the fingers to little pink blobs of flesh, as Mary bit her nails. The Littlejohns were Catholics, and even on this point Bernice was all of a sudden narrow-minded, saying that Roman Catholics worshipped graven images and wanted the Pope to rule the world. But for Frances, this difference was a final touch of strangeness, silent terror that completed the wonder of her love. "There's no use us discussing a certain party. You could not possibly ever understand her. It's just not in you." She had said that once before to Bernice, and from the sudden faded stillness in her eye, she knew that the words had hurt. And now she repeated them, angered because of the tinged way Bernice had said the name. But once the words were spoken, she was sorry. "Anyhow, I consider it the greatest honor of my existence that Mary has picked me out to be her one most intimate friend. Me, of all people." "Have I ever said anything against her?" said Bernice. "All I said was it makes me nervous to watch her just sitting there, sucking them pigtails. Braids." A flock of strong-winged arrowed geese flew over the yard, and Frances went to the window. There had been frost that morning, silvering the brown grass and the roofs of neighbors' houses, and even the thinned leaves of the rusty arbor. When she turned back to the kitchen, the hush was in the room again. Bernice sat hunched with her elbow on her knee and her forehead resting in her hand, staring with one mottled eye at the coal scuttle. The changes had come about at the same time, during the middle of October. Frances had met Mary at a raffle 2 weeks before. It was the time when countless white and yellow butterflies danced among the last fall flowers, the time, too, of the fair. First, it was honey, made crazy one night by a marijuana cigarette, by something called smoke or snow. He broke into the drugstore of the white man who had been selling them to him, desperate for more. He was locked in the jail awaiting trial, and Bernice rushed back and forth canvassing money, seeing a lawyer, and trying to get admission to the jail. She came in on the third day worn out and with the red-curdled glare already in the eye. A headache, she said she had, and John Henry West put his head down on the table and said he had a headache also. But nobody paid any mind to him, thinking he copied Bernice. "Run along," she said, "for I don't have the patience to fool with you." Those were the last words spoken to him in the kitchen, and later Bernice recalled them as judgment on her from the Lord. John Henry had meningitis, and after 10 days, he was dead. Until it was all over, Frances had never believed for a serious minute that he could die. It was the time of golden weather, and Shasta daisies, and the butterflies. The air was chilled, and day after day the sky was a clear green blue, but filled with light, the color of a shallow wave. Frances was never allowed to visit John Henry, but Bernice helped the trained nurse every day. She would come in toward dark, and the things that she said in her cracked voice seemed to make John Henry West unreal. "I don't see why he has to suffer so," Bernice would say, and the word suffer was one she could not associate with John Henry, a word she shrank from as before an unknown hollow darkness of the heart. It was the time of the fair, and a big banner arched the main street, and for 6 days and nights the fair went on down at the fairground. Frances went twice, both times with Mary, and they rode on nearly everything, but did not enter the freak pavilion. As Mrs. Littlejohn said, it was morbid to gaze at freaks. Frances bought John Henry a walking stick and sent him the rug she had won at Lotto. But Bernice remarked that he was beyond all this, and the words were eerie and unreal. As the bright days followed one upon the other, the words of Bernice became so terrible that she would listen in a spell of horror, but a part of her could not believe. John Henry had been screaming for 3 days, and his eyeballs were walled up in a corner, stuck and blind. He lay there finally with his head drawn back in a buckled way, and he had lost the strength to scream. He died the Tuesday after the fair was gone, a golden morning of the most butterflies, the clearest sky. Meanwhile, Bernice had got a lawyer and had seen Honey at the jail. "I don't know what I've done," she kept saying. "Honey and the sticks, and now John Henry." Still, there was some part of Frances that did not even yet believe. But on the day he was to be taken to the family graveyard in Opelika, the same place where they had buried Uncle Charles, she saw the coffin, and then she knew. He came to her once or twice in nightmare dreams, like an escaped child dummy from the window of a department store, the wax legs moving stiffly only at joints, and the wax face wizened and faintly painted, coming toward her until terror snatched her awake. But the dreams came only once or twice, and the daytime now was filled with radar, school, and Mary Littlejohn. She remembered John Henry more as he used to be, and it was seldom now that she felt his presence, solemn, hovering, and ghost gray. Only occasionally at twilight time, or when the special hush would come into the room. "I was by the store about school, and Papa had a letter from Jarvis. He is in Luxembourg," said Frances. "Luxembourg. Don't you think that's a lovely name?" Bernice roused herself. "Well, baby, it brings to my mind soapy water, but it's kind of a pretty name. There is a basement in the new house, and a laundry room," she added after a minute. "We will most likely pass through Luxembourg when we go around the world together." Frances turned back to the window. It was almost 5 o'clock, and the geranium glow had faded from the sky. The last pale colors were crushed and cold on the horizon. Dark, when it came, would come on quickly, as it does in winter time. "I am simply mad about—" But the sentence was left unfinished, for the hush was shattered when, with an instant shock of happiness, she heard the ringing of the bell.
This has been an Audible Inc. production of The Member of the Wedding, written by Carson McCullers.